My name is Arthur Peterson, and I'm going to tell you about the day my own family made me feel like a fool. It happened at a Sunday lunch, right after I told them I'd spent every last penny of my savings on the old, abandoned Miller farm. My son-in-law, Mark, a man who measures everything in dollars and cents, just laughed. He looked at my daughter, then back at me and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "You spent everything on that? Arthur, that house is falling to pieces. You've bought yourself a pile of rotten wood and memories." The words just hung there in the air, sharp and cold. I didn't say a thing. I just looked down at my hands. It's a strange feeling when your life's dream is turned into a joke in less than a minute. What would you do if the people you love most were the first to tell you that you'd failed? Listen to my story until the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Also, let me know from which city you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. The silence that followed Mark's words was heavier than any stone I've ever lifted. I could feel my daughter Sarah's unease, but she didn't speak up. She just fiddled with her napkin, her eyes darting between me and her husband. Mark, on the other hand, sat back in his chair with a smug look, like he'd just delivered some undeniable truth. He was a real estate agent, you see, so he believed his opinion on any piece of property was gospel. To him, the Miller farm wasn't a place with history or potential. It was just a bad investment, a liability. He saw rotting beams and a collapsed roof, and in his eyes, that meant the man who bought it was a senile old man throwing his money away. He couldn't see what I saw, what I felt for that place. He wasn't just insulting the house. He was insulting my judgment, my entire life's worth, right there in front of my own grandchildren. I just sat there, my gaze fixed on the worn-out pattern of the dinner plate. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. My hands, calloused and stiff from a lifetime of farm work, rested on the table, and for a moment, they felt useless. These were the hands that had fixed fences, delivered calves, and held my wife Eleanor when she was sick. They were the hands that had worked to give my daughter a better life than the one I had. And now, in this clean, modern dining room, they seemed out of place, just like my dream. I didn't fight back. I didn't argue. Part of me was too stunned, and the other part, a part one don't like to admit exists, felt that old sting of failure. I'd lost our first farm years ago, and maybe Mark was right. Maybe I was just an old man chasing ghosts, destined to end up with nothing but splinters. I dared a quick glance at my grandkids, teenagers who were suddenly very interested in their phones. They wouldn't look at me. I could see the embarrassment on their faces, not for their father's cruelty, but for their grandfather's foolishness. That hurt more than Mark's laughter. In that moment, I felt completely alone at a table full of family. I thought of Eleanor. She would have understood. She knew why the Miller place was so important. It was where we'd spent our first year of marriage, dreaming of a future on the porch swing. She would have put her hand on mine and told Mark exactly where he could stick his opinion. But Eleanor was gone, and her absence felt like a physical hole in the room, a space where my only defender should have been. Without her, I was just an old man with a foolish dream that everyone was laughing at. The rest of the lunch was a blur. I don't remember what we ate, or what else was said. All I could hear was that phrase, falling to pieces, echoing in my head. The drive home was quiet. The silence in my old truck was different from the silence at the dinner table. It wasn't heavy with judgment. It was just empty. But as I drove, something else started to burn under the shame. It was a quiet, stubborn anger. Mark saw a pile of rotten wood. My daughter saw a problem. My grandkids saw an embarrassment. Fine. Let them see what they wanted. They didn't know about the promise I made to Eleanor on that porch. They didn't understand that some things are worth more than their market value. As I pulled up to my small rented apartment, I made a new promise, this one to myself. I would not let that house or my dignity fall to pieces. Not without a fight. The anger I felt that night was a slow burn, the kind that keeps you warm on a cold drive home. It wasn't a fire that raged, but an ember that glowed deep inside, reminding me of all the years that came before that Sunday lunch. My life wasn't built in a clean dining room with polished silverware. It was built in the dirt and the sun, with sweat and calloused hands. I was born right here in Oak Haven, to a family that didn't have much more than their name and their word. My father taught me how to plow a straight line before I could properly read a book. He used to say, "Arthur, a man's worth ain't in his pockets. It's in the work he does and the promises he keeps." That was the only gospel I ever needed, the foundation for everything that followed, for better or for worse. I grew up knowing the rhythm of the land, the smell of the earth after a spring rain, the sound of cicadas on a hot August afternoon, the sharp sting of the first winter frost. It was a hard life, but an honest one. There was a simple clarity to it. You worked, you provided, you endured. There were no shortcuts, no easy ways out. When I was young, I'd see the old Miller farm from a distance, sitting proud on its hill. It represented something solid, something permanent. It was a testament to the idea that if you put down roots and tended to them, they would hold. That was the dream for a boy like me. Not wealth, but permanence. A piece of the world that was yours, that you could pass on. Then I met Eleanor. She wasn't from a farming family. She was a town girl who worked at the diner, and she had a laugh that could make the sourest man smile. She saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. She didn't see a dirt-caked farm boy. She saw a man with a steady heart. When we got married, we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. We couldn't afford a place of our own, not right away. That's when we found a room for rent at the Miller place. The old couple, the Millers themselves, were still alive then. They were kind, and they let us have the back room for almost nothing. That first year of our marriage was spent in that house. Every evening, after a long day of working for other farmers, I'd come home to that house, and Eleanor and I would sit on the front porch swing. We'd watch the sun go down over the fields, and we'd talk about our future. It was on that very porch, with her head on my shoulder, that I made her a promise. I pointed out at the fields and said, "One day, Ellie, I'll buy you a place just like this. Not a room in someone else's house, but a home, our home." She just squeezed my hand and smiled. She believed in me, even when all I had to offer was a promise. That memory is etched into the wood of that porch, into the very soul of that place. We eventually saved enough for a down payment on our own little farm, a few miles south of town. Those were the good years. We worked side by side from sunup to sundown. I remember the pride on Eleanor's face the day we harvested our first successful crop of corn. We weren't getting rich, but we were building a life. We had our daughter Sarah, and that little farmhouse was filled with a kind of love and warmth that money can't buy. We taught her to be kind, to be honest, and to respect hard work. I sold my father's old vintage tractor, the one thing of real value he left me, to make sure she could go to college. I wanted her to have choices I never had. I never wanted Sarah to face the kind of heartbreak the land can deliver. And it did. The drought came in the late 90s, and it didn't let up for 2 straight years. It wasn't just a dry spell. It was a slow, merciless killer. The fields turned to dust, the creek dried up, and the corn withered on the stalk. We tried everything. We took out loans, hoping the next season would be better. But it wasn't. The bank was patient for a while, but patience doesn't pay the bills. Losing that farm was like losing a part of myself. It was the place where my daughter took her first steps, where Eleanor and I had built our dreams. Selling it felt like the ultimate failure. After we lost the farm, I had to swallow what was left of my pride and go back to being a farmhand, working for men I used to consider my peers. It was a quiet kind of humiliation, showing up every day on land that wasn't mine, fixing fences that would never belong to me. Eleanor never once made me feel like less of a man. She'd pack my lunch every morning and tell me she was proud of me. Her strength was the only thing that kept my own from crumbling. But the stress of it all, the years of worry, they took their toll on her. She got sick, a slow, creeping illness that the doctors couldn't seem to fix. The medical bills started piling up, a mountain of debt that made the farm loans look small. Sarah had married Mark by then, and they were doing well for themselves. I never wanted to ask for help, but I had no choice. I had to ask them for a loan to cover a new treatment for Eleanor. Mark wrote the check, but the look on his face made it clear he saw it as a handout to a failing old man. It was another small death to my pride, but I would have endured anything for Eleanor. The treatment didn't work. I lost her 15 years ago, and the silence she left behind has been my constant companion ever since. After she was gone, I just kept working. It's all I knew how to do. I worked on other people's farms, saved every spare dollar, and lived a simple life in a small rented apartment. I paid back my daughter and Mark what I could, when I could, but I always carried the weight of that remaining debt. It wasn't just about the money, it was a debt of dignity. I watched my daughter build a life so different from the one I knew. A life of clean hands and new cars. A life where the value of a thing was its price tag. I don't blame her for it. I wanted that for her. But I think, somewhere along the way, she forgot where she came from. She forgot the feel of the earth in her hands, and the value of a promise made on a porch swing. I never did. For 15 years, that promise to Eleanor was the ember that kept me going. I wasn't just saving money, I was saving up for a chance to keep my word. I'd drive by the old Miller place from time to time. It got worse every year. The paint peeled, the windows broke, and the porch where we used to sit was starting to sag. The town saw a ruin, a blight. But every time I looked at it, I saw Eleanor's smile. I saw the ghost of a promise that was still waiting to be fulfilled. When the for sale sign went up last month, it felt like a sign from God himself. It was my last chance. I knew what everyone would think. I knew it looked like a fool's errand. But I gathered every cent I had, every dollar earned from decades of labor and loss, and I walked into the bank. I wasn't just buying a pile of rotten wood, as Mark put it. I was buying back the most important piece of my past. I was buying the place where my life with Eleanor truly began, and where I intended to honor her memory until my own time was up. They could all laugh. Their judgment meant nothing compared to a promise I made to the only person whose opinion ever truly mattered. I knew the work would be hard. I'm not a young man anymore. My back aches in the morning, and my hands are stiff with arthritis. But the physical pain is nothing compared to the ache of a broken promise. When I stood on that property for the first time as its owner, I didn't feel the chill of the wind coming through the broken walls. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I ran my hand over the splintered wood of the porch railing, right where Eleanor used to rest her arm. It was a wreck. It was a disaster. But it was mine. And for the first time since she died, I didn't feel completely alone. The town gossip started almost immediately. I'd be at the general store picking up nails, and I'd hear the whispers. "Poor old Arthur," they'd say. "Lost his mind, spending his last dime on that wreck." They didn't say it to be cruel, not most of them. It was pity. In a way, that was worse than Mark's open contempt. Pity makes you feel small, helpless. They saw an old man trying to relive his youth, chasing a ghost. They couldn't understand that I wasn't trying to go back. I was trying to go forward, to build something that would finally put the past to rest in the right way. I didn't try to explain myself to any of them. What was the point? How do you explain a lifetime of love and loss to someone who only sees a collapsed roof and a dry well? How do you explain that the value of a place isn't in its structure but in the memories it holds? You can't. So I just nodded, paid for my supplies, and went back to work. Their words were just noise, like the wind rattling the loose shutters. The only voice I needed to listen to was the one in my heart, the one that kept reminding me of my promise to Eleanor. The first few weeks were overwhelming. The sheer scale of the decay was more than I had realized. Every board I pried up, seemed to reveal more rot underneath. The place was water-damaged, neglected, and home to more critters than I could count. There were days I'd sit on an overturned bucket, covered in dust and sweat, and I'd feel a wave of doubt wash over me. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe I was a fool. Maybe this was too much for one old man to handle. It felt like I was trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. But then, something would happen. I'd find an old, rusted hinge that I remembered Mr. Miller fixing. Or I'd see the spot on the kitchen wall where Eleanor had tacked up a recipe card. These small discoveries were like little anchors to the past, reminders of why I was there. They were proof that this wasn't just a building, it was a vessel for a life that had been lived, for a love that had been real. And in those moments, the doubt would recede, and the quiet resolve would return. I wasn't just rebuilding a house. I was piecing together my own history, my own dignity, one broken board at a time. That first week, I became a kind of local curiosity. Cars would slow down as they passed the turnoff to the Miller place, the drivers craning their necks to get a look at the old fool and his pile of sticks. I'd be out there, trying to clear away the tangle of overgrown blackberry bushes choking the front yard, and I could feel their eyes on me. They weren't hostile, not exactly. It was more like they were watching a slow-motion car wreck. I'd just keep my head down, my hands busy with the clippers, pretending I didn't notice. But you always notice. You feel it on the back of your neck, that heavy gaze of judgment and pity. It was a lonely feeling, being the main attraction in a show you never wanted to be a part of. The whispers in town were worse than the stares. I went to the hardware store for a new crowbar and some heavy-duty tarps, and the usual friendly greeting from old Mr. Henderson was replaced with a hesitant, "Arthur, you sure you need all this? That place. It's a big job." His voice was full of a kindness that felt like an insult. He meant well, I know, but what I heard was, "You're too old for this. You're in over your head." As I paid, I could hear two men in the next aisle talking in low voices. I only caught a few words. Mark was right, and a damn shame. But it was enough. I just took my change, nodded, and walked out, the weight of their words heavier than the tools in my hands. My daughter, Sarah, didn't call for 2 weeks. When she finally did, her voice was strained, full of a forced cheerfulness that didn't fool me for a second. She asked how I was, but she didn't ask about the farm. It was the elephant in the room, the one thing we couldn't talk about. She was avoiding it, hoping that if she didn't mention my foolish project, it might just go away. Her silence on the matter was a verdict in itself. She was ashamed. Ashamed of what her husband had said, yes, but also ashamed of me for proving him right in her eyes. The conversation was short and hollow. After I hung up, the silence of my small apartment felt vast and crushing. The physical labor was brutal, but the solitude was what really wore me down. I'd spend 10 hours a day pulling down rotten plaster, hauling debris, and wrestling with rusted pipes. My muscles screamed in protest every night. I'd eat my lunch sitting on an overturned bucket on the sagging porch, just a sandwich and a bottle of water. I'd look out over the fields, now a sea of weeds and thistle, and the sheer magnitude of the task would threaten to swallow me whole. There were no encouraging words, no one to share a quiet moment of accomplishment with. It was just me, the creaking house, and the ghosts of other people's doubts. One afternoon, my neighbor from down the road, a man named Bill, pulled his truck up the driveway. I thought for a moment he was coming to offer a hand, a foolish flicker of hope. He got out, looked around at the piles of wood and rubble I'd created, and just shook his head with a little chuckle. "Arthur," he said, "you know, my brother-in-law runs a demolition crew. I could get you a good price. Be a lot easier than doing whatever this is." He gestured vaguely at my work. I just looked at him, my hands covered in dirt and splinters. "I'm not tearing it down, Bill," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. He just shrugged, got back in his truck, and drove away, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust and quiet humiliation. Invitations that used to be regular occurrences simply stopped coming. For years, I'd been part of a weekly poker game with some other men my age. The week after I bought the farm, no one called. The week after that, silence. I found out later from someone at the feed store that they were still playing, just at a different house. They hadn't disowned me. They'd just quietly edited me out of their lives. It was easier for them than having to face the awkwardness of my grand folly. I was the man who had made a bad bet, and in their world, you don't invite a man like that to the card table. You let him fade away. The loneliness became a physical presence, as real as the hammer in my hand. Some days, the only voice I'd hear was the wind whistling through the broken window panes. It sounded like it was mocking me, whispering all the things people were saying behind my back. I started talking to myself, just to break the silence. And I started talking to Eleanor. I'd be trying to fix a stubborn door hinge, and I'd say out loud, "Well, Ellie, what do you think of this mess?" Of course, she never answered. But imagining her there, shaking her head with that patient smile of hers, was the only thing that kept the despair at bay. The first big storm of the season was a trial by fire, or rather, by water. I had managed to patch some of the worst holes in the roof with tarps, but it wasn't enough. The rain came down in sheets, a relentless, driving torrent. I spent the night inside the house, moving buckets from one leak to another. The constant drip, 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 a maddening symphony of failure. I was soaked to the bone, cold, and exhausted. I sat there in the dark, listening to the house groan and leak around me, and I felt a profound sense of being utterly and completely alone in my struggle. Mark's words echoed in my head, falling to pieces. That night, it felt true. Even my grandchildren started acting differently. I saw them at the grocery store one Saturday. They were with their mother, Sarah. When they saw me in the produce aisle, they suddenly became very interested in a display of oranges, their backs turned to me. Sarah gave me a tight, pained smile and a quick wave before steering them away. They couldn't even look me in the eye. I wasn't their strong, capable grandfather anymore. I was an embarrassment, the crazy old man who lived in a ruin. That single moment, seeing the shame on their faces, hurt more than any sarcastic comment from a neighbor. It was a rejection from my own blood. The pitying looks became a part of my daily landscape. When I'd go into town for supplies, people I'd known for 50 years would look at me with this sad, sympathetic tilt of their heads. They'd ask, "How are you holding up, Arthur?" with a tone usually reserved for the recently bereaved. They had already written me and the farm off as a lost cause. In their minds, I was no longer Arthur Peterson, the man who had farmed, raised a family, and buried a wife. I had been reduced to a single, defining characteristic, the old fool with the worthless property. It was like my entire life had been erased and replaced by this one foolish act. Mark, of course, couldn't resist twisting the knife. He called me one evening, his voice dripping with false concern. "Arthur," he started, "I've been thinking. I have a client, a developer, who's been looking for acreage out your way. He's not interested in the house, of course, but he'd pay a decent price for the land itself. You could get some of your money back, cut your losses." The offer was an insult wrapped in the guise of help. He wasn't trying to help me. He was trying to prove his point, to be the one who cleaned up my mess. "The property is not for sale, Mark," I said, and I could almost hear his smug sigh through the phone. His call made me realize something. To him and to many others, my dream wasn't just a bad investment. It was an inconvenience. My stubborn refusal to admit defeat was an annoyance. They wanted me to sell, to give up, so they could all say, "I told you so," and move on. My persistence was a quiet rebellion against their judgment, and they didn't like it. It was easier to label me as senile or stubborn than to consider for a moment that I might see something they couldn't. My isolation wasn't just a byproduct of their mockery. It was a deliberate wall they had built around me. There were moments of profound doubt where their voices got inside my head. I'd be standing in what used to be the living room, ankle-deep in debris, my back aching, and I'd wonder if they were right. Maybe I was just a stubborn old fool chasing a memory. Maybe I had thrown away my last years and my last dollars on a pile of rot. The weight of it all would settle on my shoulders, heavy and cold. It was a tempting thought to just walk away, to call Mark and tell him to bring his developer. It would have been the easy way out. But then I would remember Eleanor's face, the light in her eyes when she talked about having a home of our own. I would run my hand over the rough, splintered wood of a windowsill, and I would remember her standing right there, looking out at the sunset. This wasn't just about me proving them wrong, it was about me proving her right. She had believed in me, in my promises. Giving up on this house would be like giving up on her memory, letting it be buried under the rubble of other people's opinions. And I couldn't do that. I wouldn't. So I kept working. I started getting up earlier, before the sun, and working until it was too dark to see. The physical exertion became a kind of therapy. Every rotten board I ripped out was a piece of their doubt I was casting aside. Every nail I hammered home was an affirmation of my own resolve. The town could whisper. My family could keep their distance. But out here, in the dust and the sweat, I was in control. The world had shrunk to the boundaries of this property, and within these fences, their judgment had no real power. The isolation, in a strange way, began to forge a new kind of strength in me. When you have no one to rely on but yourself, you discover reserves you never knew you had. I learned to patch a roof, to brace a sagging floor joist, to rewire a faulty socket. I learned that the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the sounds of my own work, my own breathing. I was no longer just fixing a house. I was rebuilding myself, away from the prying eyes and pitying glances of a world that had written me off. One evening, as the sun was setting, I finally cleared the last of the debris from the main room. For the first time, I could see the original stone fireplace, black with soot, but solid and unyielding. I stood there, leaning on my shovel, covered in grime from head to toe. I looked at that hearth, the heart of the home, which had stood firm while everything around it crumbled, and in that moment, I fully understood. In their eyes, I was a fool. In their stories, I was a cautionary tale. I had become Old Man Peterson, the crazy hermit with the worthless property on the hill. And I found that I didn't care. Let them have their stories. Let them have their pity and their jokes. I looked at that stone fireplace, a monument to endurance, and I felt a kinship with it. They saw a ruin, but I saw the foundation. They saw an ending, but I knew, deep in my bones, that this was just the beginning. The world had cast me out, left me alone with my pile of rotten wood. They had no idea that in the quiet heart of that isolation, I was closer than ever to finding what truly mattered. You see, everyone who laughed, everyone who pitied me, they all started from the same place. They looked at the sagging roof, the broken windows, and the overgrown fields, and they saw the end of a story. They saw decay and failure. What they didn't know, what no one could have known, is that I wasn't looking at the end of anything. I was looking at the heart of the matter. I was looking at that big stone fireplace, the one thing in the whole house that was still solid, still standing strong against the years. They saw a pile of soot-stained rocks. I saw a promise, locked in stone. It's funny, isn't it, how people can look at the exact same thing and see completely different worlds. I suppose it's time I was honest. I haven't been entirely truthful about my reasons for buying this place. I let everyone believe it was just sentiment, an old man's foolish dream to honor his late wife. And that part is true. It is for Eleanor. But it's not the whole truth. My decision wasn't a gamble. It wasn't a leap of faith. It was a certainty. When I handed over every last cent of my savings for this property, I knew exactly what I was buying. I knew because I was the only person left alive who knew its secret. I wasn't buying a pile of rotten wood, as Mark so elegantly put it. I was buying a bank vault with a field around it. The secret wasn't something I stumbled upon. It was given to me almost 50 years ago right here in this house. Eleanor and I were just kids then. renting the back room. Old Mr. Miller was in his last days, confined to his bed. His wife had passed a few years earlier, and he was all alone. He'd watched me come in from a long day of farm labor, see the way I looked at Eleanor, and I guess he saw something of himself in me. One evening, he called me into his room. His voice was a dry whisper, but his eyes were clear. He told me he knew he didn't have long, and there was something he couldn't take with him, a trust he needed to pass on to a worthy heart. He made me swear an oath of silence, a promise I have kept for half a century. Then he told me about the fireplace. He said his own grandfather, the man who built this house with his bare hands, had lived through times when you couldn't trust banks or governments. He was a man who believed in tangible things, stone, steel, and gold. So he built a hidden compartment right into the hearth, lined with tin to protect it from fire. He told me exactly which stone to pull, a loose one behind the firebox that no one would ever notice. He said what was inside was the Miller family's anchor, their hedge against the kind of ruin that had just destroyed my own father. Inside that stone vault, he said, were two things. The first was a steel lockbox. It held the family's emergency savings from the 1920s, before the Great Depression wiped everyone out. Not stocks or paper, but real gold certificates, the kind backed by actual gold in the treasury. They were hidden away and never spoken of again. The second thing was a set of journals, his grandfather's journals, detailing the building of the farm and the digging of the well. And in those journals, he said, was the location of the true treasure of this land. He told me the real value wasn't in the gold, but in the water. This is the part that even I could barely believe at first. Tucked inside the main journal was the original property deed, filed with the county back in the 1880s, when things were messy and records were kept by hand. That deed showed the property line extended a quarter-mile further east than the current maps showed. And on that forgotten parcel of land was the source of the underground spring that fed half the wells in this valley. A natural, artesian spring that never, ever ran dry. Not even in the worst droughts. He told me that while everyone else's wells went dry, his never dropped an inch. He had the rights to the most valuable resource in this entire region. Mr. Miller made me promise him two things. First, that I would never speak of it to a soul. He feared that if his own children, who had moved away and cared little for the farm, found out, they'd tear the place apart looking for it and sell the land off to the highest bidder. Second, he made me promise I would only act on the knowledge if I could one day buy the farm myself, to live on it and preserve it, not just to profit from it. It was a sacred trust, a secret I carried out of that room and locked deep inside my own heart. I was a young man with a secret that could change my life, but I was bound by my word. For decades, that secret was a quiet, heavy burden. When the drought hit and we lost our own farm, the irony was almost too much to bear. I knew that just a few miles away, there was a source of water that could have saved us. I knew there was a fortune hidden in stone that could have paid off our debts. But I had given my word to a dying man. I couldn't break it. So I stood by and watched my own dreams turn to dust, all while guarding a secret that felt more like a curse than a blessing. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, harder than burying my own wife. I never even told Eleanor. How could I? How could I tell the woman I loved that a solution to all our problems was just out of reach? It would have been a cruel kind of hope to live with. I wanted to give her a home, not a lottery ticket. The secret was mine to carry alone. I thought it would die with me. I worked, I saved, I lived my quiet life, and I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for exactly. Maybe just for a sign that I had kept my promise long enough, that my honor was paid in full. When that for sale sign went up on the Miller property, it felt like the world shifted on its axis. It wasn't just an opportunity, it was a release. All those years of waiting, of silence, they all led to that one moment. Every dollar I had saved wasn't for my old age. It was for this. It was for the chance to finally fulfill my promise to Mr. Miller. and in doing so, to finally keep my promise to Eleanor. So when Mark laughed at me, when the town pitied me, I let them. Their disbelief was the perfect camouflage. It kept them from looking too closely. It kept the secret safe. So no, I didn't just stumble upon it last week. The day after the deed was signed, I came here, to this house. It was quiet, and the air was thick with dust. I walked straight to the fireplace, my heart pounding not with anticipation, but with a sense of profound homecoming. I reached behind the firebox, my fingers finding the familiar rough edge of the loose stone Mr. Miller had described all those years ago. It came free with a soft scraping sound. And there it was, the dark, hollow space, just as he said. It wasn't a discovery, it was a reunion. I pulled out the old steel box. It was heavy, dense with history. Inside, the gold certificates were pristine, wrapped in oilcloth. I'd had a quiet word with a rare currency expert in the city years ago, just showing him a photograph I'd once managed to take. He'd estimated their value, even then, was immense. After a more recent, discreet appraisal, I know their worth is just shy of $500,000. More than enough to do what needs to be done. More than enough to make them all eat their words. But I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt a quiet, soul-deep relief. But the real power, the real justice, wasn't in the paper money, it was in the deed. I unrolled the brittle parchment, and there it was, in faded ink. The legal description of the land, including the rights to the Miller Spring. In a region where a good well can double the value of a farm, owning the source of the water is like owning the bank. It's a generational fortune. It's the ultimate security. It's the final, silent answer to the drought that took everything from me. They saw a dry well and a worthless plot. I knew I was buying the lifeblood of the entire valley. And then there were the journals and the little velvet pouch. I sat on the floor for hours, reading the words of the man who built this place, his joys and his struggles. And in the pouch, I found the silver locket. I opened it, and there was the faded photo of the young Miller couple, full of hope. On the back, the inscription read, "Where our love built a home, may our fortune find a worthy heart." I held that locket in my calloused hand, and I knew I had finally honored the trust placed in me. I had been deemed worthy, not by a bank or a real estate agent, but by history itself. So you see, all the mockery, all the pity, it was all based on a lie. Not my lie, but theirs. They built a story around me of a foolish, sentimental old man, and they believed it because it was easier than looking deeper. They judged the book by its tattered cover, and never once thought to wonder what might be written inside. My silence wasn't weakness or shame. It was a shield. It was the quiet, patient strategy of a man who knew the real value of things, a value that can't be seen from the road or calculated on a spreadsheet. I hold the truth in my hands now. The certificates are secure, and the deed has been quietly and legally affirmed by a lawyer from out of state. The power has shifted. It's no longer in Mark's condescending smirks or the town's pitying whispers. It's here, in the solid ground beneath my feet, and in the silent, steady promise of water. The game they thought I was losing, I had already won before it even began. And now, all that's left is to rebuild this house, not just with wood and nails, but with the quiet, unshakable strength of a promise finally kept. For a long time I just sat there on the dusty floor, the cold steel of the lockbox on one side and the brittle papers on the other. The weight of it all, 50 years of a kept promise, settled in my bones. I didn't feel a rush of excitement like a man who'd won the lottery. I felt a deep, profound stillness. Revenge? The thought flickered and died. What would be the point? To drive a new truck into town and watch Mark's jaw drop? To show them all my bank statement? That would make me just like them, measuring a man's worth by the size of his wallet. That wasn't justice. That was just noise. My promise to Mr. Miller wasn't to get rich. It was to find a worthy heart. My promise to Eleanor was to give her a home. My final decision was simple. I would do both. I would use the Millers' fortune to rebuild their home, and I would live out my days here, in peace. The first step was silence. Absolute, unbroken silence. I found a lawyer in a city 2 counties over, a man who didn't know Oakhaven from a hole in the ground. He handled the authentication of the certificates and the quiet affirmation of the old deed. The money appeared in a new bank account that no one here knew existed. Then, I hired a small crew of Amish builders from a neighboring community. They were men who understood wood and stone, men who valued work over words. When they arrived in their simple buggies, the town gossip mill went into overdrive. They assumed I'd taken out some massive, desperate loan. I could almost hear them saying, "Now he's really lost it. He'll be bankrupt by Christmas." I let them talk. Their ignorance was the best protection I could ask for. The work was a kind of prayer. The Amish men worked with a quiet efficiency that shamed the memory of all the doubt I'd faced. A new roof, solid and true, replaced the tattered tarps. The sagging porch was rebuilt with strong oak, an exact replica of the one where Eleanor and I had sat. And then came the day the well drillers arrived. I didn't tell them about the spring. I just pointed to a spot marked in Mr. Miller's journal. They drilled. All day the sound of the rig echoed across the valley, and then, late in the afternoon, there was a different sound, a roar from deep within the earth. Water, clear and cold, shot 20 feet into the air. The driller, a man who'd done this for 40 years, just stood there, speechless. He said he'd never seen anything like it. I just nodded. It wasn't a miracle. It was a promise kept. A month later, the house was no longer a ruin. It was a home. The fields, irrigated by the endless spring, were already showing the first green shoots of new life. I sat down at the solid kitchen table, the smell of fresh-cut wood and paint still in the air. I took out a new checkbook. I thought back to that day in Mark's office, the humiliation I felt when I had to ask for money to try and save my wife. I remembered the look on his face. I wrote a cashier's check for the exact amount I had borrowed. Then I spent an hour calculating a generous rate of interest for all the years that had passed. I put the check in a plain envelope with a small handwritten note. It contained only 5 words. "My debts are now paid." I sent it by registered mail, requiring a signature. There would be no phone call, no gloating, no explanation. The final word had been said. Now I spend my evenings on the new porch swing, watching the sun set over my fields. I don't feel anger or triumph. I feel a quiet, settled peace. I know that Mark and Sarah received the check. I can imagine their confusion, then their frantic calculations, the rumors they'd hear about the farm, the spring. I know they'll never understand. They'll see the money, and they'll be consumed by what they lost, by the opportunity they ridiculed. But they were never meant to understand. The real treasure was never the gold certificates or even the water. It was the value of a man's word, the strength to endure ridicule in silence, and the love that built this place. They saw a house falling to pieces, and in a way, they were right. It was their world, their way of seeing things, that was falling apart. Mine was finally whole.